Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC Round 2/Round 3 overview and analysis video in the season finals. It's always hard to try to figure out how to title these videos, but in today's video, we are going to be seeing winners finals. We are going to be seeing our lower bracket Round 2, which is our third, fourth place matchup. That might determine who ends up going to Worlds to represent the LEC. We have a lot on the line here today, but I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. Of course, if you're interested in my thoughts leading up to this, check out the videos up in the iCard. That's going to be both of the Round 1 videos, upper bracket and lower bracket Round 1, to know how we got here. But of course, you can also check out the LEC Summer Split playlist up in that iCard. That's every single week and every single playoff series of the Summer Split up there as well. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, go ahead and check it out. It's definitely worthwhile to see where my thoughts and opinions were coming into this week. But of course, no prior viewing necessary. I am going to be going over every single thing. We're going to be previewing each series, and then we're going to be talking about it. If you are new here, the way that this is going to go is we are going to go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover. And then at the end of each series, we will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be talking about our upcoming series, our semifinals, at the end of this video. But again, most of it is going to be spent on the two series we got this previous weekend. So without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. The first series is going to be our third, fourth place matchup, our lower bracket round number 2, and this series is incredibly important. By the end of this series, we might know the 3 teams that are representing the LEC at Worlds this year. But obviously, both of these teams want to keep their season finals hopes alive as well. This is still kind of the biggest trophy domestically in the LEC, so it is still pretty important for these teams to at least go out there and try to win it. It's a matchup between the number 1 seeded G2 Esports and the number 3 seeded Team BDS. This is certainly not the matchup we expected here in lower bracket, mostly because I think everybody is still stunned that G2 lost to Mad Lions in the upper bracket in round 1, but both of these teams got the job done against their opposition in pretty quick succession. In last weekend's, games, their best of 5s, BDS being able to take care of SK Gaming, G2 definitely taking care of Giant X, neither of them really putting up all that much of a fight. And so both of these teams are going to be coming in with at least some confidence, some momentum. You know, G2 probably a bit less than maybe you would expect because they probably shouldn't be here in the first place, but that's also the big reason why they are big favorites coming into this series. Not only are they obviously on paper a bit better than BDS, but man, if you want to look at the historical matchup between G2 and BDS over the last 2 years, it is not kind towards BDS. It is not kind towards their success and their probabilities in this series. It just feels like G2 has always been able to get the upper hand in this matchup, and one of the big reasons why is that Caps has just really figured out Nuke. There are some matchups, especially at top levels, where certain players just kind of beat certain players. We think a lot about like Doran just being better than Zeus over in the LCK. We think about, even recently someone like Lucid just having a very good matchup into Canyon, regardless of the fact that Canyon's better. One of those matchups in the LEC is Caps into Nuke, who Caps just always obliterates him. Nuke has played every single one of the worst games he's ever played against Caps, and I don't know what it is. I don't know if Caps just understands the matchup a bit better. I don't know if Nuke gets scared going up against the EU GOAT. Like, genuinely, I don't know what the problem has been, but historically, this has been very in favor of G2 in the middle of the map, and that's been a big reason why G2's never particularly struggled with this series and with this team in a best of 5, really under any circumstance. Even best of 3s typically have gone their way. They've dropped a best of 1 here and there, but for the most part, G2 has had a really, really good record against BDS, all things considered. The only concern, I would say, for G2 is that I think you could make the argument that BDS maybe has the better bot lane in this series. Iceland and Labrav have been probably the most consistent bot lane in the LEC and are probably, bot lane 1, at least in terms of what I'm evaluating. I don't think that means that they are going to always dominate. I don't think any bot lane in the LEC is quite as good as like the best junglers or the best mid laners at this level. I just don't think that you're ever going to get that same level of performance out of the AD carries that are at this level, but Ice is probably about as close as it gets. And when you talk about playstyle, that's BDS's road in for the most part. It's being able to play through the bottom of the map. Hans and Mickey, very lane focused, early game focused. Mickey's very aggressive in the early to mid game. You can punish that. You are able to generate leads almost exclusively off of Mickey being out of position or trying to take advantage of his over eagerness, oftentimes alongside Yike, and you can kind of snowball games out of control. Typically when G2 loses, that's exactly kind of the formula that they lose in, but Hans is also a very lane-reliant player. He's really not all that consistent in the mid to late game. He's not a phenomenal team fighter. He's gotten better, I would say, forte at team fighting on G2 than what he was on Team Liquid or on Rogue, even on Misfits back in the day, but he is certainly not like a star in the 5v5s, and that's really where Ice ends up thriving. If you can get out of these games relatively neutral going into the late game and Ice has some gold and is able to fight front to back, I think you might actually be in a pretty good position moving forward in those instances. And so that's probably the win condition for BDS, is to slow the pace of the game down. I think G2 has shown quite a few cracks in the armor in terms of their decision making in particular in the back half of a lot of these games, and I think that could be a positive. The other thing is that Yike is in really bad form at the current moment. I don't know how long that's going to last, but it's certainly something that we're going to have to continue to monitor. If Yike continues to be bad, BDS might actually be able to get advantages in the early game as well, which might mean that they are able to generate a lot more pressure. But when you go down the line, at least in terms of talent, you would expect G2 to just kind of be better in every single role. Caps over Nuke, obviously. Broken Blade probably over Adam. As much as I like Adam, Broken Blade's probably the best top laner in the LEC in Europe right now. Yike over Sheo, at least in terms of top end performances. Like, you just feel really good about G2, and obviously this is not one of those teams that you want to count out. They've won 5 of the last 6 LEC trophies, and so we'll see if they can keep that streak alive and get themselves into the top 3 with a win here, or if BDS can actually keep their world's hopes alive and pick up a win in this series. The only way to know is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was BDS. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is exactly how you would want this start of the series to go if you're BDS. You needed to get out to a big early advantage, and that's exactly what they did here. Now, the only big concern that I have is G2 is actually pretty notorious for losing game 1s. They've not been good at game 1s all year long. I think they lost game 1 in all 3 of the finals that they played over the course of this year, but in winter, spring, and in summer, in all 3 of them, and then went on to win in 4 games. And so you're not taking your victory lap just yet if you're BDS. This is also a team that has struggled to close out some series, but at the end of the day, this is such a good look in game number 1 that it's really hard to sit there and be like, I'm worried about BDS. Something is wrong with G2. I mean, they are just making super uncharacteristic mistakes. I think a couple of players in this game were truly awful. One of them definitely less surprising than the others, which we will definitely talk about, but this is not the G2 that I think a lot of people were expecting to see in the season finals after dominating basically the entirety of the LEC season. So we'll talk about what they can do to potentially turn it back around after game 1. Player of the game in game 1, though, is going to go to Lebrov for me. It has to go to one of the 2 bot lane members, either Ice or Lebrov. I thought the setup here on the Rakan was exceptional. Lebrov sometimes gets these comments where people label him as a rel one trick. I don't think that that has ever been the case. He's always been incredibly good on Rakan, and I know that feels like a very similar style. He's definitely an engage-oriented player. He's not somebody that would thrive in like a more enchanter-oriented meta in the same way that other supports would right now, but, you know, he can play Braum at a high level. Like, he can basically play any of the engagers, any of the more beefy bot laners well. He plays Leona very well, and so Nautilus, like, I'm not worried about Lebrov. A lot of talk about whether or not his skill set actually translates at the top level. I believe it does. I think he has been the best support in the LEC over the course of this year, and this game was a big proponent of that. Like, this is one of those, like, this is why I've been hanging on to Lebrov. This is why I put him in top 3 for my MVP voting for the year, because he'll have games like this where he's just constantly creating opportunities for everyone on the team, but specifically for Ice to try and get fed so that in the late game, he can take advantage of his really good positioning, his really good understanding of team fights, and Lebrov is probably the best team fighting support, like, in the West. He's one of the better ones in the world, at least in terms of consistency. It's something he just really thrives on, finding those flank angles in a lot of fights. Honestly, it reminds me of a player like Crisp, especially like Prime Crisp. I'm not saying that he's as good as Crisp was, but like playstyle-wise, like finding these flank angles, you know, often finding himself in the right position at the right time. It's really fun to watch, and so really excited to talk about Lebrov and to get to hype him up again, but Ice was also very good. The Ezreal has been a pretty massive pick for this team. Not that there aren't quite a few massive picks for this team. Obviously, the Ashe and the Jinx are the 2 that come to mind first, but Ezreal has certainly been up there. Jhin is something that Ice has done really well on. It's just really hard to take what I consider the best AD carry in the LEC out of his comfort zone. He's just going to be really, really good in a lot of different circumstances, and like we said, if the bot lane ends up struggling in the early game and donates a lot of gold and a lot of kills over over to the BDS bot lane, that's a problem. Like, there is a lot of opportunity for G2 to just, like, lose the game at that point. And so it's definitely going to be a thread we continue to follow. The R5 Mundo actually kind of worked. I mean, the lane swap wasn't ideal. It actually ended up with G2 getting a pretty big gold lead, but, you know, obviously Adam was much more relevant in the late game than Broken Blade was, even with the rest of the team kind of struggling around him. Sheo, Nuke, they were good this game as well, but I would say Ice and Lebrov definitely the standouts in the bot lane. And then for G2 on the other side, just some frustrating gameplay. Like, Mickey X is the easiest dud of the game I could possibly give. This was a truly exceptional inting performance. Like, it is difficult to be this out of position in a lot of circumstances, but this is just kind of what happens when you play Nautilus and when you're Mickey X. I think people just continuously forget how many of these games he's had over the course of this year, not even just on Nautilus, on a lot of different champions. You know, I've been getting a lot of criticism for saying that Mickey X wasn't like a top 3 support in the LEC this year, but I'm sorry, like, I haven't seen it. He was really good at MSI, and that's it. Like, that is genuinely the only time that he has played well throughout this entire year. He'll have games like this where he just insta loses it for G2 by moving around the map unnecessarily, getting caught out, going in without the rest of his team's approval. Like, maybe you can get away with some of these more aggressive engages, but Mickey certainly wasn't able to in this one. This is one of the games where people would point at like a Hylissang or a Lebrov or another one of these engage style supports and say like, oh, these guys are garbage, they're trash, we always overrated them, but because it's Mickey, people excuse him. There is no excusing this. This is just as bad as any of the bad games from anybody else, and I would say he's had a lot more of them than a lot of supports over the course of this year. But Caps was also really bad here, and this is honestly kind of a recurring trend. Caps has not been very good in the past like 2 weeks. You have to imagine that he's going to snap out of it. This isn't a player that you necessarily expect inconsistency from, but at least at the moment, like, he's just not been very good over the past couple of weeks, and he is so integral to G2's success. The reason that they are struggling and the reason that they dominated in the first place is because Caps is so much better than everybody else in the league, or at least he was for the course of this year. But if he's not going to be that, if he's just going to be an average to even at times slightly below average mid laner, at least in terms of the 1v1 performances and the ability to carry in the late game, then this team's not going to win a lot. Like, they rely on Caps a ton. Like, Caps is the star for a reason. If he's not playing well, G2 all of a sudden turns a lot more mortal. So we'll have to see how that goes. Broken Blade, Hansama, they got giant leads in the early game, but weren't able to actually do anything with it after the lane swaps because their macro was garbage, and Yike continues to just not know what to do in the early game. Like, I hate to say it. It feels like this guy's brain is completely shut off. I'm a big fan of Yike. I was a big proponent of Yike, but it feels like he's way too passive now, especially on something like the Ivern with a lead. So G2 definitely need to fix some things. You gotta get Caps going, but you gotta rein in the bot lane. If bot lane can just like survive, I think the rest of this team is so much better than BDS that I think it should be fine, but the bot lane is not guaranteed to just survive. So we'll see how that goes. G2, of course, doesn't want to go down 0-2. Anything can happen in the LEC season finals, but going down 0-2 is basically a death sentence. Winning 3 games in a row is always a difficult challenge. But for BDS, if you can get that 2-0 lead, you're gonna feel really, really good about the way that this series has started. So who's gonna be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was BDS. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0. And man, we are really getting on the precipice of some interesting outcomes. G2 would lock a lot of things in terms of like determining world spots and just kind of general expectations moving forward in the season finals. Them losing in this series is by far the most interesting outcome we could look for. And they are now down 0-2 against BDS. All BDS has to do is win 1 of the final 3 games, and they're going to be moving on, and they keep their world's hopes alive when it looked like it was all but dashed coming into this series. What a game from BDS. They, again, just kind of torched G2. They got online. They have this late game front-to-back comp that they're able to execute on, and it just goes better. G2 with a very, I guess, a risky draft is probably the kind way of saying it. Ego draft, in my opinion, where they're just picking carries in every role and hoping somebody steps up and somebody ends the game. But unfortunately, a couple of these guys end up playing poorly, and the ones that do play well don't have enough support in order to actually go out and win the game. And so you end up in these circumstances where G2 just doesn't actually have the comp to end up winning it, and BDS is able to just steamroll in the late game. We're going to talk about that, but player of the game, it's got to go to Nuke. I talked about this at the beginning in the preview. Nuke's stats against Caps are horrible. Like, historically, he's just done very poor into Caps. I don't really know what it is. Sometimes it's just like a mental thing, but if you wanted a performance that says, like, yeah, he can do it, like, this is it. He can freaking do it here. He was awesome on the Corki. I get that some people are a little bit higher on Corki than maybe I am. He's a very good champion. He's not, like, mid laner 1, at least in my eyes. He's close to it, and he's probably the most safe and versatile mid laner in the game. I think Tristana maybe offers just a tad bit more on a consistency basis, but, you know, Corki is right up there, and we've seen it struggle in the West, if only because teams are not very good at playing around it. And so to see Nuke come out, get super fed in the mid game, and just be able to obliterate people in the back half here, it's very cool, very important. I do want to shout out Labrov, though. This guy's insane. Like, I hope this guy starts to get the credit that he deserves. I get it that maybe I was a bit overzealous putting him top 3 in my MVP voting. I don't think I was. I truly think he's been a top 3 player in the LEC over the course of this split, or this year as a whole. But what I really can't get behind is this idea that he's not just been the best support. Like, I don't think there's anybody that's even been remotely close to what level Labrov has been playing at for a majority of this year. You know, outside of the spring split, he really hasn't had any bad games. He's had just a lot of really good performances, and he continues to shine. I mean, completely outplayed Mickey. Obviously, Mickey is just going to run it when this team starts to lose, but it wasn't just like, oh, he was the better support. He was like a genuine X factor in this game. Some of those engages on Rakan are genuinely phenomenal, and again, he's just so creative in terms of how he gets to his end goal. Ice was very good. Shale looked awesome. Sejuani continues to be the best jungler in the game, and people continue to not recognize that. Adam was certainly fine enough on the Rumble. It wasn't necessarily a make or break game from him, but BDS being up 2-0, that's the story. Like, the story is that they now have full control of this series, and all they have to do is close it out. And then for G2, disaster has struck. Losing game 2 is not good. Like, this is not a good circumstance to put yourself into. And again, this draft is just so greedy. It's so ego. There's really not a lot of ways for me to praise it. You've got exclusively damage dealers on the top side of the map. Maybe you can talk about Aatrox being a more supportive pick, but, like, what are we doing? We're just hoping and praying that somebody, or maybe everybody, just ends up winning 1v1, gets fed enough to be able to carry the game and just end it. Like, I just hate this idea. I think it is so lazy in terms of a draft, and they did not play well enough to be able to get those leads and to be able to hang on to them in the late game. Caps is a super easy choice for dead of the game. Whatever voodoo magic is over him right now, he has just played really bad in the past couple of series. He was okay, I would say, against Giant X. Wasn't necessarily the standout in my opinion, was certainly fine, but that Mad Lion series, he was horrible at the end of it. This series against BDS, he's not been good at all through the first 2 games, so I don't really know what's going on. You have to hope that Caps can turn it around, because if he can't, this team is doomed, because look at, like, the rest of this team played fine outside of Mickey X. Mickey X was once again horrible, and I definitely considered him for dead of the game because he had another really bad one here on the Rel, but Hansama played great. I thought he was really good this game on the Misfortune in terms of his positioning. He's always been known as kind of a clutch playoff performer, and that continues here, but there just wasn't any support. If you had any CC coming out of the top lane, if you had like a tank or any setup coming out of the jungle, literally anything, then perhaps Misfortune could have actually tried to wombo combo people down in some of these fights, but because you didn't have that, because you have a Brand and an Aatrox, this Misfortune actually can't really do any of the things that she wants to do, because Rel is dying instantly. Either that or Rel is dying before the fight even starts when it comes to Mickey X. So not a good game from G2. They've got a lot they need to figure out, and they have to do it now because they are 1 game away from having their domestic year end. They've obviously already qualified for Worlds, and so maybe they're just not taking this seriously, but I have to imagine there's enough pride on the line to want to try to win the season finals, the biggest domestic tournament of the year. So we'll see what ends up happening for them, but BDS now has the chance to close this out. If they can beat G2 in 3 games in a clean sweep, move on to the next round to take on the loser of Winners Finals, the semifinals here, that's gigantic. Who's to say BDS can't be a Worlds team if that ends up happening? But they have to do it. Like, you can't let G2 get back into the series. The moment you give them an inch, they're going to take 6,000 miles. They're going to take every single game, and so you've got to close it out here, in my opinion. BDS, can they do it? Are they going to be able to close it out in a clean sweep, or is G2 going to be able to keep this series alive at the very least for 1 more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was G2. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive in this series by still being down 1-2, but at the very least taking their first game, and obviously they needed this. If they lost this, they would have been eliminated, but even more so, they needed a game like this, where it wasn't just, oh, G2 comes out and does just enough to get by. They needed a game where they could come out, dominate, and just kind of win. Like, 27-minute, shortest game of the series, 13-1 in kills kind of win. Like, that is what you were looking for from G2. G2, I think their comp is significantly better than it was in Game 2. I was very critical of their draft in Game 2. I think this is much more cohesive. I think BDS actually still has a very good draft on the other side of this matchup, but when G2 has these options available to them, all of a sudden things get a lot easier. Now, some of this was bailed out by BDS not being quite as strict in their banning process. They banned out Nautilus and Leona on the second phase. I just entirely disagree with that. I think putting Mickey on Nautilus and Leona is honestly kind of what you want at the current moment. Give him opportunities to kind of run it down himself, but nope, they took that away. They wanted to play a little bit more in terms of the Braum safety, late game, Sejuani plus Corki duo. They wanted to play for that a bit more, not give, G2 really any avenues to try to make plays on their own, and in doing so, they gave G2 a ton more plays than they typically would have to make plays on their own. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Caps in the mid lane. He really needed this one. I think, again, just as we talked about G2 really needing to have a performance like this where they come out and dominate, Caps needed a performance where he just came out and was the better mid laner. It had been quite a while before we were really saying that. Even Jackie's kind of gave him a run for his money in that Giant X series, and we were really just waiting on Caps to show up and be Caps, to be the best player in Europe, to be the player that I gave pretty unanimous an MVP over the course of this year. He's easily been the best player in Europe in 2024, and that's all just kind of been non-existent, at least in the season finals so far. So for this Game 3, where it is imperatively important for him to show up, him being really good on Tristana is really, really important. I think Yike had a lot to do with that as well. We criticized the Ivern in Game 1, at least in terms of how they went about executing it. I think this game, it was a lot more active. I think some people are going to give credit to a lot of the other players like Hans, Broken Blade, and Mickey. We'll get to them in a second. They all played really well in this game, but I think Yike is going to go under the radar for how good of a Game 3 he ended up having. He can really, really struggle on champions like this that don't necessarily have the clearest objective in the world. That's not to say that he can only play carries. He's very good at tanks, but tanks and carries both have a very clear idea of how they need to play out both the early and the late game. Ivern is a bit more up in the air in terms of the situation, and I think sometimes that can be a bit of a problem for Yike, but when it does end up working out, when he has these really good games, they look great. He looked great in this game. He played fantastic. I think Broken Blade is the third member that I really want to shout out. I just like this Cassante a lot more than I liked the Aatrox pick in game number 2. I'm just not a huge fan, especially with the way that G2 has been playing around topside right now with putting him on something more aggressive. If they're going to leave him isolated in this 1v1, even if he is going to be better than Adam, and I would say arguably especially if he is going to be better than Adam, then put him on a tank, put him on something that can be weak side, that's going to be useful in the late game no matter what, because if he's going to be better than Adam, then he's going to go even, he's going to shut down a lot of these aggressive tendencies in the top lane, and then he can be a setup man for a Caps, a Hansama, or someone like that in the late game, and that just gives you a lot more options. So generally, I think a lot of this change is just them finally getting a draft that they can play, and I think obviously there is some them stepping up in it, right? But I think they've made it a lot easier on themselves in Game 3 than they did at the start of this series. And then for BDS, this was not a particularly good game. This is not really one that you take away a lot of good things from. I think you just kind of have to try to put it on the back burner. Basically, everybody ended up getting completely gapped in their own role. We'll kind of go through one-on-one and just kind of talk about the things that ended up going wrong. But yeah, this was not a good game from BDS. They did not look like a team that was trying to close out the series. That I will definitely say. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Nuke in the mid lane. I was praising him in the previous game on the Corki. This is just one game. I'm much more willing to be optimistic about Nuke than I am to be pessimistic, because he has been so good throughout basically the entirety of 2024. He has really stepped up and emerged as one of the big three in terms of the mid lane right now in the LEC, and just because it hasn't necessarily shown up in best of fives up until this point doesn't mean I think it can't get there, but this was definitely a bit more of what we've seen from Nuke against Caps as opposed to what we saw in game number 2, which you're kind of searching for. Ice and Labrov also just didn't win in the bot lane. These early games are just so chaotic because of the lane swaps and because of all of the stuff happening. Not that this game was more so or anything than the last one, but Ice and Labrov really need to be able to get those mid-game leads. If they're going into the late game down a ton of gold, that's a big win condition for BDS that's just kind of off the board. I think Sheo wasn't particularly good in the early game here. Obviously, Adam has not really been a carry for this team in the season finals. He's really not been all that great in this series, really, even through the first 3 games when they were winning. So, there are definitely still some concerns for BDS, but they still have control of the series. They're still up 2-1. G2 would still still have to win both of the final 2 games, but game number 4 becomes imminently more important, with BDS now being in a situation where if they don't close it out, the series is tied up and you've lost all of your momentum. You've lost all of your confidence going into game number 5, not to mention this is already a team and an org kind of known for getting reverse swept, and so it's definitely on their mind. But if G2 can pick up that win in game 4, you've got all the momentum, you've got all the confidence, and you go into a do or die Silver Scrapes game 5, which I'm sure they feel pretty confident that they can actually win. So which team is going to be able to win it? Can BDS close it out, or is G2 going to push us to that Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was G2. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up this series at 2 apiece, and what do I even say? I mean, I hate to say it, but this was honestly kind of predictable. I mean, BDS up 2-0, the kings of getting reverse swept. G2, the unconquerable in the season finals, really so far in 2024. What did we think was going to happen? I mean, truly, this is the most poetic way for the first 4 games to go, and regardless of how game 5 goes, we are going to be getting an amazing narrative. Either G2 is out and BDS bucks the trend, or history repeats itself and BDS can't close things out again. Either way, it's going to be an absolutely fun conversation to have. But this game 4 was already kind of fun in and of itself. It was certainly a lot more interesting than game number 3 was. It really felt like BDS was a lot more in it than they were game number 3, where they kind of just got slaughtered across the board. G2 was definitely more mortal in this game, but at the same time, still a very clear idea of where they wanted to play. This is a very modern comp from them in terms of how they ended up, assembling it. Like the Zyra plus Smolder is something that we're seeing a lot of over in the East right now, because Smolder is just such an insta-win in certain conditions, and Smolder's been very popular here in the LEC as well. Obviously, people are going to point to Mirwin playing it in the top lane, but we've seen a lot of AD carries and mid laners kind of prefer this champion, and so to see it get picked up here by Caps and to have it be such an influencing figure in the back half of the game is obviously very important. But player of the game to me is actually going to go to Yike in the jungle. I felt like he was more relevant to the entire game as a whole, and honestly, I thought his pathing was near perfection in this game. When you're going up against something like Maokai Corki, when BDS is continuously opting into these late game 5v5 type of comps, you need to be able to put your foot on the gas in the early game to be able to establish that tempo and pressure as quickly as you can do it, and that's what Yike was able to do in this game on the Zyra. We've seen way too many games where this champion just kind of does her own thing, goes neutral, and then doesn't have the same kind of pressure or prio in the late game as something like a Maokai or a Sejuani or something a lot more consistent, right? Well, when Yike plays it, and when this team has a clear idea of where they want to put their resources in the early game, yeah, you can start to get this Zyra moving around the map. And of course, getting the Smolder ahead was a big part, but Hans and Mickey, I thought, had a really good game down in the bot lane. Hans is very good at Ashe. It's actually very fun to watch him just like step up in the playoffs. Like at this point, there's really no other way to say it. He gets a playoff buff. Now, I wish that extended to like Worlds. I wish he was getting Worlds and international buffs, but that's part 2. That's the next step of the process that he can hopefully develop. He has just always been so good in these pivotal moments, specifically for G2, where he has simply gotten better than his regular season performance every single time they get into these best of 5s. Mickey was really solid in this one. This was easily his best engager game of the series. Obviously, the Seraphine in the previous game was good as well, but it's nice to see him get to play Nautilus and not just get completely obliterated in every single mid game, and so that was cool. Broken Blade looks great on the Cassante. This is something I expect this team to continue to go to, or at least things in this vein. Overall, G2 again just has a much clearer idea of what they want to do, and now they're dominating this series and they have taken full control of the momentum. But for BDS, you have to start getting at least a little bit concerned, because this is not a team that has been the most resilient over the course of the last couple of years. And I feel very bad in saying that, because I'm sure it's not just like 1 or 2 players that are like dragging them down. I don't want to try and sit here and say that, oh, bad mental XD, but like, it's just unfortunate that this has become such a running trend for BDS, for them to get in such good positions at the start of series and for these series to go long and them not being able to hang on. I think part of it might just be exhaustion. Maybe these players are just players that aren't very good at playing 5 straight games in a row, like on a high pressure environment, high pressure stage. Like that is always something that we kind of fail to take into account, that it's not necessarily like a choke artist thing, that it is just players not being quite as used to it. G2 has played many a best of 5 over the course of their time. All of these players have experience playing high pressure pressure best of fives on bigger stages than this, maybe with the exception of Yike. And so you feel pretty good about G2 in these big situations, but BDS, like, it's just not a team that has been, you know, kind of shown that way all that much, and we could perhaps be seeing some downturns in that regard. Dead of the game is going to go to Labrov for me on the Alistair. This wasn't quite as bad as some of Mickey's performances in the first 2 games, where I thought he was genuinely just running it down, but he certainly was not an impact in this game. In the moment that BDS started to get behind, Labrov just kind of became a liability. There's not much the Alistair can do to retain a lot of the pressure that he's able to generate, but Nuke continues to kind of just get outplayed. In the mid lane here, you've got a scaling matchup in the mid lane here, as we've got Corki with Smolder, and, you know, typically speaking, this is something that I would consider to be Smolder favored. I think he is just stronger so long as you're able to get him online. I think Nuke has to be aggressive. He has to be willing to try to take a lot of these trades in the early game, and it just didn't feel like they had that sense of urgency. The moment that Caps got online, Nuke was not really able to match in terms of the damage, and he got caught out a couple of times as well on the Corki in some pretty unideal situations. But Ice, Sheo, Adam, they were generally fine. Adam gets a solo kill in the top lane on the Rumble. I mean, that looked pretty good. You're pretty happy about that. Obviously, Broken Blade basically walked into that, so it's not entirely Adam doing it, but he was able to pick up some gold in the early game. But Sheo just not able to really get to the point where Maokai's able to take over. The reason he's worse than Sejuani is because you get to these situations where he just doesn't have the same kind of pressure in the early game. He can't actually compete with things like Zyra nearly as much, even if he is better in the late game. And then, you know, Ice on the Ezreal was really good, but only so much you can do when the rest of your team is losing. So for BDS, you just got to figure it out. If you can win game 5, if you can dispel that, you know, curse that seems to be placed upon this team, especially against a team like G2, that's going to be such a massive confidence booster potentially moving forward in this tournament. But if you can't, you are eliminated and your year is done. G2 playing for a lot less here, because even if they lose, obviously they're still going to Worlds, but it's a lot of confidence on the line for this team that wants to prove that they can still definitively be the best team in the LEC. So who's going to be able to take game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 5 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to win this series, and the reverse sweep has been completed. The fates of both of these teams remain constant, and G2 comes out on top. Not only is BDS not able to conquer the demon that is G2 that seems to have plagued over them the last couple of years, but to do it in such excruciating fashion is genuinely absurd. BDS has now officially gotten reverse swept in a best of 5 by all 3 of the teams that are going to Worlds. We'll talk more about that going forward. This G2 win means a lot more than just G2 moving on to the top 3. It solidifies the 3 representatives from the LEC to make the World Championships, and again, we will speak on that, but congratulations to G2. They're going to Munich. They're going to get to play in the finals here in the season finale, and, you know, they're going to get a chance to continue their streak of championships. They looked great here in Game 5. Honestly, this Game 5 was very similar to Game 3 in terms of just kind of a dominating performance from G2 very early on, a lot of great macro plays, and just a team taking a lead and snowballing it out of control and making the game not particularly close. There really isn't a ton to try to analyze here out of game number 5, so I'm just going to talk a little bit more generally about these teams as a whole, but Caps is going to get both player of the game and player of the series in game number 5 here, and he's earned it. Like, he really struggled through the first couple of games. I'm certainly not going to try to deny that. Games 1 and 2 were not ideal, but both of these stomps were essentially through Caps' Tristana in the mid lane. This is a champion that I think it'll be pertinent to take away from him as we go further along into the season finals, but once he was able to get online in a couple of these games, it ended up looking phenomenal. It wasn't just him, but they need him. They need him to be the best player on the Rift. They need him to be somebody that can step up and beat anybody in the LEC, because without that, they're really not one of the better teams, or at least it hasn't felt like they are. They felt significantly more inconsistent when Caps is not stepping up. He is so integral towards what G2 do, and so when he is able to dominate like he was in games both games 3 and 5, you do see the noticeable difference in terms of how this team ends up operating. I want to give a big shout out to Hansama. Again, he just had another great series. He only plays well in these best of 5s. Not that he plays horrible throughout the rest of the year, just the level goes up so much when he gets into these clutch best of 5s. These arrows from Ashe, they were phenomenal. I mean, you could see it throughout basically the entirety of this series. Anytime he got this champion, those ultimates were landing. I mean, he was landing cross map ones. He lands one on Nuke in this game that ends up getting Caps a really important kill. Overall, just like Hans looked awesome, and he continues to look great in these best of fives. It's a really great time to step up and be one of the better players in your role. Mickey looked much better down the stretch, but how much of that is the rest of the team doing well? I'm not entirely sold on Mickey just yet. Broken Blade and Yike were also very good in the back half of this series. Broken Blade more so, in these team fights on this tank-oriented role, like it seemed G2 was just kind of destined to need to go to. And then Yike, I thought, had great early games throughout the entire back half of this series, and that's really all you can ask for from him. For G2, you've got to be excited about this win. They are going to be moving on now to the semifinals, and they're going to have a chance again to defend their season finale title. But for BDS, that's it. It's over. 2024 is done. You have now been eliminated from the season finals. You've been eliminated from Worlds contention. There is no way for this team to make the World Championships in 2024, and it's just a little bit sad. They've always felt like the high floor, low ceiling team, so I'm not surprised to see that they are one of the ones that don't end up making it. But if they had the opportunity to take on a team like Mad Lions, would they be able to overcome them? Are they the third best team in Europe? That's something that we're probably not going to find out the answer to, unfortunately. We'll get a clearer picture for sure in the series after this that we cover, but they've got to be disappointed, especially because they were up 2-0. That is the no-brainer, right? Is you just have to win one of the final three. Getting reverse swept once again for the third time this year, it's got to feel like heartbreak. There is genuinely no feeling I can imagine that would even come close to how bad that has to feel. And it's not like they played well in Game 5. It's not like it was close and it just barely slipped out of their hands. They got obliterated as they did in Game number 3. Even Game 4, it wasn't particularly close. G2 definitely had a lead for the entirety of the game. It just was closer than the other two blowouts. And so it's not like you lost gracefully. There's not a lot of positives to take away from this Game 5, but for the year as a whole, man, there are a lot of positives to take away from. Ice and Labrov were probably the best bot lane in the LEC when you look at the entire year as a whole. Ice has really emerged as maybe the best team fighter in the region. Labrov is, in my opinion, the most consistent support in the LEC, and I think they are your biggest strength. Nuke had a career year, in my opinion, in terms of what he put out in the mid lane. The performances he was able to put out this split were just phenomenal. It was genuinely terrific stuff from Nuke. I thought Sheo was fine. He was great in the playoffs for this team and was pretty good in their win over SK Gaming, and that's something that you really want to hang on to. Adam is obviously someone I believe in a lot. BDS has so many positives, and so for the narrative to probably be, oh, BDS was just never good enough to make Worlds, it's definitely a bit disappointing. Unfortunately, dud of the game in Game 5 is going to go to Nuke, but come on, man, it's the same as Game 3. It's all of them. There is no one player that I can sit here and say was infinitely worse than the rest. I think Cassio was definitely picked on a bit more, obviously with the Ash arrows and just generally the pressure in the middle of the map with Caps getting super far ahead. The Cassio had a really hard time staying relevant, but it wasn't just Nuke. Adam didn't play particularly well outside of laning phases. Sheo didn't really get to do anything in the early game in the back half of this series, just being on Maokai duty every single game. Their own doing, by the way. And then Ice and Labrov were not the better bot lane. When it mattered the most, the best bot lane wasn't the better bot lane, and that's really an unfortunate set of circumstances. And so for BDS, you have to feel a bit disappointed, but unfortunately, they're going to have to try and see what they can go into next year. I don't know what kind of moves this team makes. I think that there are a couple of players that I have to consider the core of the team. Ice and Labrov, to me, have to stick around as a duo. I think they were simply too good for a majority of the year to let go, and I think Nuke is certainly worth bringing back. We'll see what else they end up doing. I think it'd be fine if they ran back the 5. I honestly don't think that would be awful, but something tells me that probably won't be happening for BDS, and so we'll talk about that, obviously, in the offseason. But not only did G2's win mean a lot to G2, up on the screen, we have our final two teams to qualify for Worlds from the LEC, Fnatic and Mad Lions, who we are going to talk about in just a moment in their winners final series, because they are guaranteed top 3 now. And G2 is also in the top 3. That means those are the 3 teams going to Worlds. Of course, if BDS had won this, then it would have opened the door for a lot more possibilities, because G2 has locked in that World spot by being the Summer Split champions. And so if they were not in the top 3, then it would only be the top 2 that end up qualifying for Worlds. But because G2 is in the top 3, that means both Fnatic and Mad Lions have officially qualified for Worlds. Fnatic, this is not surprising. This has been the expectation all year long. They've kind of been the second best team to G2 in terms of the performances they put out. But Mad, certainly a lot of people are going to be a bit frustrated by this. I think it's generally fine. I think they made finals in winter. I know that feels like forever ago, but it's the same exact team that made finals in winter, and they earned their spot with that win over G2. So I understand that people are frustrated that, one best of 5 and now this team is at Worlds, but they set that up for themselves by being more consistent than SK or any of those other teams over the course of this year. The only frustrated team I think should be BDS, because they were a higher seed and just unfortunately didn't get to run into a G2 team that clearly clearly wanted to lose on the day. But you've got to give credit to Mad Lions, you know, where they've earned it. They were consistent enough in terms of their output over the course of this year to get into a position where that one win could seal their fate. So those are your three teams that are going to be going to Worlds, but G2 kind of sealing that all in with a win here. And then moving on to our second series of the video, and this time it's winners finals. This is obviously a very important series for both of these teams. Both of them have already qualified for Worlds, so that's not on the line like it could have been depending on an outcome, but still making the finals of the season finals is a very big accomplishment. These teams very much want to be considered the #1 team in the LEC, and seeding is very much still up for grabs in terms of who ends up going to Worlds as the 1, the 2, the 3 seed. Obviously doesn't matter quite as much nowadays because of the Swiss stage, but still, you know, pride on the line. It's a matchup between the #2 seeded Fnatic and the #4 seeded Mad Lions Koi, and this is a very intriguing matchup on paper because when you look at it from the lens of just like the summer split and what we've seen specifically over the past 2 months, this should not be all that close of a series. Fnatic has absolutely been the better of these two teams. Mad Lions has really struggled to find any semblance of consistency, but they pull off a massive upset in round #1, defeating G2, getting themselves into this situation, and now, of course, qualifying for Worlds, which is pretty massive for them. How do they stack up, though, against Fnatic? Is this, you know, some sort of fluke? Is their win over G2 something that's not going to be replicable, or is this team going to be able to go toe-to-toe? Well, on paper, I think that there are more positives than maybe a lot of people are giving them credit for. Yes, this team really did struggle in the summer split, but they are very, very streaky. This is a very interesting roster because so many of these players have very well-defined strengths and weaknesses, and that means when they win very hard, and when they lose very hard, and that can create some situations where these teams are just not all that consistent, and that's been the case for Mad Lions. But honestly, like I said, when you match them up one-on-one with a lot of the Fnatic players, there actually is quite a bit to like. I think you look at the jungle matchup and say, well, yeah, Razork's absolutely been better than Elyoya over the course of this year, but it's not like Elyoya has some sort of history of not performing in the clutch. This is a guy who, in his rookie year, won 2 LEC titles. He's a 3-time LEC champion. He's been to, what, 4 LEC finals? This guy knows what it takes to be near the top of the totem pole, and he's done it with a rookie roster at the beginning of this year, at least making finals. And so you never know if Elyoya is just going to show up and have a really good series. He's not exactly been a carry point for Mad Lions, but you never really know. At any point, he could be the #1 jungler in the league in terms of the performances that he's putting out. We've seen that from him before, but Razork, of course, favorited going into that. Then you've got like Humanoid versus Frescowy. Frescowy was horrible in the summer split, but he was also a big source of like optimism throughout a lot of the winter and the spring split for Mad because of just how quickly he was able to adapt to playing in the LEC. He was actually a very big positive very early on for Mad, and although again, Humanoid is going to be the favorite in this matchup pretty clearly, you never really know what Frescowy can do. And then you start to get to the matchups that aren't exactly as cut and dry, as even. Supa and Alvaro in the bot lane, in my opinion, probably one of the 3 to 4 best bot lanes in the LEC. You know, I think a lot of people meme on them because there are some performances that look a little suspect, but I think when you really go back and examine a lot of the tape that they put out over the course of this year, a majority of it is positive. A majority of it is actually really good from them. And honestly, Noah and Jun, they've not exactly been the strongest bot lane in the world over the course of all of this year. It's kind of a tale of two halves. Supa and Alvaro were definitely better at the beginning of the year. I think Noah and Jun were definitely better in the back half of the year. That leads me to believe that Noah and Jun are favored in this 2v2, but again, you never really know with Supa and Alvaro. Their upside is really high. They can beat anybody, and then you really get to the intriguing matchup of this series, and that's Oscarinin versus Mirwin in the top lane. To me, this is the biggest question mark. This is going to kind of determine a lot of the direction that this series ends up going in. Both of these players are very flippy. Mirwin obviously way more flippy. The games that he loses harder than basically anybody in the LEC, but he's able to just go out there and win a lot of games as well, which we saw in game #1 when he was going up against G2 and he's pulling out all these crazy pocket picks that G2 just wasn't ready for and they had no answer for, and all of a sudden they've lost the series. It was pretty insane. Outside of that, Mirwin's been really bad. When he's on actual top lane champions, the things that are actually meta, he's been maybe the worst top laner in the LEC, but it's these crazy, weird, off-meta picks that end up really working out for him and creating space that just isn't normally created by by other players. And so we'll have to see how Oscarinin deals with that. Another player who's kind of known for just losing in the top lane, who's not exactly the most consistent player of all time. He'll have great performances, and honestly, over the course of the summer split, there were quite a lot of very good performances, but he is not prone to getting absolutely smothered in the top lane and just getting destroyed, especially if the enemy team is going to put resources into trying to get their own top laner ahead. And so we'll have to see how that ends up going. Of course, Fnatic are going to be big favorites coming into this because Matt is already an upset being here, but you never really know what can happen, and the only way to find out is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Mad Lions Koi. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And wow, I did not expect them to come out and just obliterate Fnatic in game number 1. This is a very standard, very straightforward draft, at least for the current meta that we're in for Mad Lions, and yet Fnatic had absolutely no responses in the early game. Mad Lions had a very clear idea of where they wanted to put their resources, who they wanted to get ahead, and man, once they got ahead, there was absolutely no derailing the Mad Lions train. This is genuinely a ridiculous game number 1. This looked like the best team in the LEC in terms of what we saw in this game. Mad Lions really peaking at the right time. For Fnatic, this is definitely a shock. I think they definitely came into the series with the expectation that they were just gonna be better, especially because you would think they would have better early games. I think Mad Lions a little bit more known for these weird mid-game plays, and Fnatic very strong individually in terms of their mechanics. You would expect them to be able to beat basically anybody outside of G2 in just like a hands-off, if you will, and that did not happen here. I mean, they got completely outplayed basically in every single role. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, no brainer. It's going to go to Supa. I get the title of, Supa Glazer all the time on this channel, and honestly, it kind of is deserved. I am clearly much higher on him than literally any other analyst is out there, but there's just no way for me not to watch his tape and see so much of a, future star in him. It's everything that you could want out of the AD carry role. It's just not consistent. There are going to be bad plays. There are going to be bad games, but for a rookie AD carry that has been thrust into a role where at times throughout this year, he is legit the only player on the team that is even trying to play well. I think he's done a magnificent job, and when he is enabled, when the rest of the team is playing well and they want to play through him, he can take over games like this. He was able to dominate early, get a ton of gold on the Misfortune, and then completely take over in the back half. He even made some really interesting decisions. We saw him buy the Seeker's arm guard specifically for the Zhonya's, the invulnerability property. That's a really smart move for a Misfortune who is obviously going to get dived or dove by the Vi and by the Rel, and the Corki or the Jhin could try to blow her up. Then, all of a sudden, you have this big out with an item. It's a really good move. Obviously, a pretty heads-up play, but it's his mechanics and his active gameplay that ends up making him one of the most interesting AD carries to watch in the LEC. Again, I'm not trying to sit here and tell you that he's a perfect player. I'm certainly not trying to sit here and tell you that he's guaranteed to be a superstar one day, but I think as a young AD carry in the LEC, I understand that he made a funny comment about Deft, but he is probably the closest we have to a future star in the AD carry role in the LEC. Full stop, end of story. Kalista is going to get there. Ideally, that's the circumstance that we're going to see next year. But as of right now, Supa is as close as we've gotten to a stud AD carry prospect in forever. I mean, truly years. He is the best ADC prospect in a while. He beats out all of the other players that have ended up coming up and having okay-ish or even not very good rookie years and then just kind of fading into the background. He really is kind of a trendsetter in terms of the gameplay that he's been showing. Alvaro, of course, deserves a lot of credit too, but Elyoya looks so good on the Maokai. This is a very interesting champion because he does one thing super well, and that's not very common in the current meta, where you're seeing a lot of jack of trades, junglers, or at least junglers that can try and function in a lot of different areas. Maokai is not an early game powerhouse. He is somebody who you draft specifically for the late game fights, and he is the strongest in that role, in my opinion, in the entire game. It's kind of, again, the difference between him and Sejuani is that Sej offers a bit more in the early game, has more agency, but isn't quite as dominant in those front to backs as someone like Maokai is, especially at securing objectives. But Elyoya makes this champion look completely effortless. Great game from him. Frescowy looked great on the Ezreal. Mirwin was fine on the Cassante, which is a blessing. Sometimes he can really struggle on that champ. Just a good game overall for Mad. And for Fnatic, I mean, kind of a disaster in game number 1. Again, I think they just kind of overlooked Mad Lions. I have the sinking suspicion that they came into this series expecting to just completely blow out Mad, prove that they were flukes the whole time, and now they've been absolutely obliterated in game number 1. They got to get their heads on straight. Fnatic, especially a couple of these players, are certainly known to underestimate opposition, to take it easy in games that they think they're supposed to win in the past, and so it's nice to, maybe see them get a reality check. Maybe this is the right time for that to happen, and they can wake up in game number 2, but dead of the game is going to go to Razork. My concern is that Razork always goes through these stretches where he's just not very good. There are just like 1 to 2 week stretches multiple times throughout the year where you just have to live with Razork not being all that good of a jungler. You don't want that to happen right now. That would be an absolute disaster for Fnatic, and he got completely outplayed by both Elyoya and Fresskowy for a majority of this game. Supa was able to completely take over, and a lot of that was Razork just not having any pressure, diving in and immediately dying, and again, kind of getting countered by heads-up plays on the other side for Mad. Not that anybody else played like any better. Humanoid wasn't very good in this game on the Corki. Jun wasn't very good in this game on the Rel. Those two in particular definitely stood out with some of their negative plays, but overall, Fnatic just has to get their head on straight. They have to get locked in, or else this is going to be a disaster for them. So we'll see if they can do that, if they can tie up things in game number 2, or if Mad's going to be able to take a very dominant 2-0 lead. I know we just saw a reverse sweep, so it feels kind of hollow to say this, but reverse sweeps are not very common in best of 5s. Getting that 2-0 lead could be a backbreaker for Fnatic. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and yeah, they needed this victory. Going down 0-2 against Mad Lions. Again, we already saw a reverse sweep in this video, but you can't be reliant on that. Winning 3 games in a row against anybody is just a really difficult thing to do, and getting that momentum back here in game number 2 was very important, and especially because game 1 was such a stomp. Having game 2 also kind of be a stomp, but just in favor of Fnatic, I think is significant, especially in terms of the development of where I think these teams might go with draft throughout the rest of this series, which we'll definitely talk about. Mad Lions continuing to invest a lot into these comps that are kind of foolproof in the late game, but don't necessarily have nearly as many options in the early game, and that leaves the door open for Fnatic, who, is also picking kind of for late game here with the Maokai plus the Corki to even have more prio, if only just because you've got a Poppy in the top lane that should be fine into the Cassante, and Maokai is going to at the very least be active on the map because he is a very difficult champion to end up stopping, and we've seen it succeed really well here in the LEC. So Fnatic, again, just with a little bit more options in the early game, and really, I think for these two teams, it's come down to whoever gets the early game lead ends up winning the game. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Noah. I think the moment that he was allowed to get online, the moment that Razork and Jun were really starting to enable him as a player, the moment Alvaro started getting caught out towards the bottom side of the map, that's when Noah really started to take over. All he needed was a bit of gold here on the Ezreal, and it became significantly easier to play out the rest of this game. Of course, people are going to talk about some of his arcane shifts being a little too far forward, and, I agree with that. Sometimes he can be a bit too aggressive, but he knows the limits of this champion very well. It's kind of a signature champion, at least in terms of what he has played in the LEC, and so I'm not surprised to see him get super fed on this and then end up taking over the game. Like, having all these mid-game fights end up going in his favor. But I do want to shout out the Maokai plus Corki duo. I know some people, especially North American fans, are going to look at it and say, well, it's about how you play it, but if you can play it, this duo actually does incredibly well, and it's done especially well here in Europe. I think this has really been kind of the combo that's really taken over the LEC. Every single league kind of has their own meta in terms of the champions that work and don't work. I think especially here, Corki is kind of inevitable just because games aren't quite as, secure in a lot of circumstances. And, Maokai is just one of those champs where if you do get the ball rolling, it just snowballs entirely out of control. And specifically in a series like this, and honestly throughout the entire league with the exception of G2, I would say basically every team in the LEC just wants to win early and snowball. That's kind of been their goal. And so to have Maokai plus Corki and to get that on board and online, I think just makes a lot of sense. Poppy, a really good pick in the top lane so long as you were actually trying to lane with it. I like Leona. I think it's fine. It's one of the engagers in the meta that you can play, but Fnatic just looking a lot cleaner and a lot more dominant in terms of their mechanics. And then for Mad on the other side, kind of got a taste of their own medicine from game number 1. They just were not able to keep up with the early pressure that Fnatic was able to throw at them. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Alvaro in the support position. I think Alvaro is a really good player, and honestly, again, I've hyped him up a lot, but he can get in that LEC support syndrome, the Mickey X, the Hillisang, where he can just overstep on a champion like Nautilus and just cause a lot of these plays to happen. Now, I will kind of point out, Fnatic really made it a priority to try to take down the Nautilus first in a lot of these fights. I'm not necessarily sure that's ideal. I think it's probably better to target things like the Cassante to make sure that they can't wreck you or just like get in Ezreal or Corki's face and just try to demolish them. But it was their priority to take down Nautilus in a lot of these fights. And so Alvaro's, KDA might look a little bit worse than maybe it would in other circumstances. But overall, I just don't think he had a particularly good game. Not that anybody else did. Mirwin wasn't even involved in one of the kills throughout this game. That's certainly not ideal. Elyoya lost pressure super early onto a Maokai, which is basically a disaster. Fresskowy, Supa, neither were able to carry. Fresskowy in particular, I thought had a pretty bad game on the Zeri. But it is just game 2. The series is now just tied up at 1 apiece. It's not over by any stretch of the imagination. Whoever wins this game 3, though, is going to be in a prime position to take the rest of the series. As I always say, game 3, when tied up at 1-1, becomes the most important game in a best of 5. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to go up in this series for the first time 2-1, and they have put Mad Lions on series point heading into game number 4. This was another very good game from Fnatic. Much more back and forth from both of these teams. Some good early game advantages for Mad and some really clean execution in the later half of the game from Fnatic. It really did feel like a bit of a split map for a majority of this game, which we will definitely talk about, but Fnatic a lot more clinical. They, unfortunately for Mad fans, had the best player in the game, and it wasn't close, and that was Noah in the bot lane on this Misfortune. Very, very easy choice for player of the game. A fantastic Misfortune game from Noah. We're seeing the power of this champion in this series in particular. We've already seen 2 games where she's just been able to dominate if she is put in a good position by the rest of her team, and you got to give, the champion a lot of props for that. Obviously, there is a lot of easy to execute things on the MF if you're getting good CC layering from the Leona and from the Gnar, and all of a sudden things get set up easier and those bullet times become very difficult to deal with. But I mean, Noah deserves a ton of credit for it as well. The positioning was excellent. The aggressiveness was excellent. Sometimes the fear is that on MF, you have like so many ways to pull the trigger that if you do it at the wrong time, you could just completely throw away the game for your team, especially in such a high pressure, very tense game number 3 where Mad was actually playing pretty well down the stretch. Noah had to be perfect, and he was. He was excellent here on the Misfortune. I expect to see a lot more out of this champion. I think Jun deserves a lot of credit as well. It's not very easy to make sure that Misfortune always has good opportunities in the late game. You need to be a very good and a very consistent support, and Jun was able to really set that up very consistently throughout the entire series here. So big credit to him. He's been unbelievable basically ever since the spring split playoffs, MSI, and then basically all of summer. He has been one of the best supports in the LEC. I was really ragging on the signing in the offseason because he wasn't very good at all in the LCK, but as we've seen, bottom tier LCK players, high tier Challengers League players over in the LCK, they can make for very, very dominant LEC caliber players. It's just kind of the level that the league is at. And so Jun really succeeding now. It took him some time to get going, but he has really, gotten online. Humanoid, Razork, they were fine. Razork in particular was very influential in the back half of the game, even if I didn't really like how he played out a lot of this. But Oscar, definitely some concerns. Getting solo killed by Mirwin in the top lane on the Nidalee is not ideal. Obviously, you had to expect on R5 that Mad was going to be cooking something up, that they were at least going to be attempting to try to take a big risk in this one, and they did. They picked up the Nidalee, which is not the scariest champion in the world, like in terms of, off-meta, crazy stuff. This is something you probably prepared for if you were Fnatic going into this series, but Oscar clearly did not have the tech because the Gnar was not it in this matchup. He gets solo killed. Fortunately, the Nidalee just completely dies as this game goes along. Like, there is literally nothing coming out of that champion the further it goes, but Oscar, it was in no small part due to him. Like, it was not his doing that ended up getting Fnatic out of that sticky situation. So credit to Noah, credit to Jun. They really did kind of carry Fnatic in this instance, but for Mad, it was their bot lane that really started to concern me. Not their bot lane in general, really just Supa, who had a bad game here. He's going to get dud of the game. I know I definitely get the reputation of not calling Supa out on his bad games because I just think his bad games are way better than people give them credit for. He's typically not nearly as bad as you will see on Reddit, and oftentimes with Mad, you can pinpoint to at least 1 or 2 other players that have been worse than Supa in a lot of these instances, but, even if Mirwin was worse down the stretch, which he definitely was, when you talk about, like, the pivotal team fights of this game, the Nidalee was essentially a minion. Like, this was a 4v5 in the back half of this because Nidalee was just not a champion, but Supa was worse much before that, and so, you know, I am going to give him dead of the game here. The Ashe just was not very good. He got completely outplayed by Noah. The moment that he lost tempo and pressure in the bot lane, he just completely became irrelevant. Even the arrows really weren't all that effective throughout this game. It just wasn't a particularly good game from him, and this does show the variance that not only Supa, but all of Mad Lions end up having, because, again, you look at Mirwin, and maybe people want to give him dead of the game because he literally did nothing down the stretch in this one, but at least he was able to get that solo kill. At least he was able to do something interesting in the early game here. That's not something that I can say the Ashe was able to do, and it sucks because I think the rest of this team was actually really good here. Fresskowy was amazing on the Tristana. This is genuinely one of the best games that he's played in a while. It just kind of got wasted in a situation where Mad really wasn't good enough across the board to be able to win it. I thought Alvaro's engages were generally fine. Elyoya was certainly pretty good this game on the Maokai in a lot of these fights, but again, it doesn't really matter if you've got the weak links in the game. We thought that was going to be Oscar Rinnan after the early game. It turned out to be Supa, and it turned out to be Mirwin, but for Mad, you just got to pick the pieces up here. You're still in this series. If you can win game 4 and push this to a game number 5, things become a lot more interesting. Anybody can win a game number 5, so you just have to get yourself there. But for Fnatic, I'm sure they want to close this out in 4 and not leave the option open for some weird shenanigans moving into that Silver Scrape. So, who is going to take it? Is this series going to be over in game 4, or is Mad going to push us to that game 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Mad Lions. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up the series at 2 apiece, and we are heading to yet another Silver Scrapes game number 5. I guess this makes up for the lower bracket round 1 being both sweeps. This definitely kind of makes up for that in that regard. We are getting the distance in both of the series in today's video. I'm very excited to talk about where this series is going and project what could happen in a winner-take-all game 5, but we got to get through game number 4 first, and there is quite a bit of interesting stuff to talk about in this one. Mad coming out with kind of a Fnatic-esque game here in game 4, showing that there is a lot of fight and a lot of resilience to this team and to this roster. And honestly, I think they played this game really well. I think for a lot of this game, it felt like they were definitely in a position to compete to try to win the game. I know that feels like such an obvious thing to say, but oftentimes in the LEC, when you're getting into the mid game, into the late game, you know, can very much feel like one team is just getting completely comp diffed because of the choices that they've made in drafts here in the LEC. It just kind of is the way that it is, but Mad had a lot of options going into the back half of this game, and they could really rely on some of their best players. And once again, I know that I'm gonna get flack for this, but in the big moments where this team needs somebody to step up, it's the bot lane that continues to really shine. In this game, for me, Alvaro is a very clear player of the game. I didn't have to think about this at all. He is the guy that stepped up and really made a huge impact in this one. The support gap between these two teams was genuinely ginormous here in game number 4, and I genuinely just don't think they win it without Alvaro playing as well as he played. Now, Supa was great, and he was doing a ton of damage on the Ezreal throughout basically all of this game, cleaning up a lot of the things that Alvaro or Mirwin or Elyoya were able to create for him, but Alvaro was the guy, like in terms of the one that they were playing around and the one that really stood out to me. Braum in particular has been kind of an LEC staple over the past like 2 years or so. Mickey X, obviously very famous on it last year, but even going back to last year, there were moments where, you know, Fnatic was playing it a lot. There were moments where Mad was playing it a lot. Now Alvaro picking it up in some clutch moments, and so it's really interesting to see kind of the development of each league and each region and what champions they individually prioritize. Not that Braum is bad in these other regions or is underplayed in these other regions, but rather that he's just played a lot more and a lot more effectively here in the LEC. He's a star kind of support in the LEC. He just doesn't really get played like that in other regions. So really nice to see Alvaro have a good game on him. Again, Supa deserves a lot of credit for the good game here. It really has come down to which AD carry can get more fed, and I know that feels obvious because it's the current meta and marksmen are just ridiculously strong, but it's very important to point out that if either of these AD carries just completely shits the bed, the game is like over. Like Noah has not had any bad games. Supa has had, you know, one or one and a half, I guess, really bad games here for Mad. But, you know, if one of them just completely shows up and the other doesn't in game 5, I think that could be a really determining factor for who ends up winning the series. But Fresskowy continues to be awesome. He was legit like one Tristana buffer away in game number 3 from having this be a 3-1 in favor of Mad. And so, you know, the LeBlanc game looks good here. Elyoya, Mirwin, they look solid. Another Nidalee top game, even though it didn't necessarily work out. You know, this game, it definitely was, I guess, a bit more impactful, but not really. It just wasn't as much of a detriment because the game didn't go 85 minutes this time. But Mad continues continuing to have a style that they want to execute on, and if they can get that bot lane rolling, they can genuinely beat anybody. And then for Fnatic, like, it's just unfortunate. You probably wanted to close this out in 4. You probably wanted this series to be over, but yet here we are. We're still alive, and a lot of that, in my opinion, is because Jun just was not very good in this game on the rel. He's gonna get done of the game very easily for me. He just needs to be more decisive and then also less decisive. Like, it's very strange. It felt like he just made all the wrong calls in this game, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes you're a support and you make the decision to go in, or you make the decision to back out, and it's the wrong one. And you just kind of have to be like, okay, well, I'm not going to get it right every time. Nobody gets it right every time. Not even the best shot callers in the world get it right every time. But it's just unfortunate when you watch a game where everything just kind of goes wrong, where when he is going in, he's getting blown up immediately, and he's not really causing any sort of positives for his team, and when he's not going in, there are obvious opportunities, and Mad's just kind of allowed to do whatever they want, and it's really frustrating, I think, when you are, you know, a fan of Fnatic and you're trying to watch this, because it really should be a lot easier than this, but it's not. Like, playing rel at a top level, especially into something like Braum, Ivern, like, one wrong step, as we saw here, and the game is over. Like, you just completely lose instantly, so Jun needed to be better. Again, Noah kind of got outplayed by Supa, but that's part of the process. Whichever AD carry ends up getting fed ends up winning this series. You know, I thought Razork and Oscar needed to be better. Razork in particular, this Zyra, it's just so hard to grasp onto whether or not I really believe in this pick, because when it works, it looks fine. Like, it's not exactly like dominating, but it wins a lot, and then when it's not working, it doesn't look useful at all. And so, but those times are like significantly less. It's just very weird. It feels like the peaks of this champion aren't very high, but the lows aren't very common. So it just feels very strange to try to evaluate her as a pick. I think it's fine, but Razork was whatever in this game. He couldn't do any damage in the late game, because look at the comp of Mad Lions. Oscar continues to be an afterthought for this series. I thought he was going to be a lot more interesting and important than he actually has been. Again, Huma was fine, I would say, generally throughout most of this game, but Fnatic, they got to step it up. They do not want to lose to Mad Lions. If Mad comes out of this series with yet another win, if they're going to be in the finals of the season finals here in the LEC, that's really going to put a big statement stamp on it. They've already put a pretty big statement that, yeah, we deserve to be at the World Championships, but can they cap that off with a series win here and a move on to the finals, or is Fnatic going to be able to close this series out and take the spot that I think they expected to have going into this series? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 5. They're going to close out this series with a 3-2 win, and they will be moving on to the finals of the season finals here in the LEC. Mad Lions, of course, with this loss, moved down into the semifinals, the lower bracket finals. We will see how that ends up going. Of course, we're going to preview that a bit at the end of this video, but congratulations to Fnatic. They earned it. They kept their patience in after that game number 4. They were able to maintain that momentum and confidence they generated, and they came out with the result that I think they walked in expecting to get. This is kind of a necessity in terms of outcome for Fnatic. They kind of had to win this. If they lost this, it becomes a lot more murky to not only win the season finals, but even really to make the finals of the tournament in the first place, because of course the loser here meets G2 in the semifinals, and that's never going to be an easy road when their back is up against the wall. But Fnatic came through. They came through in the clutch, and they did what they needed to do. Player of the game here in game number 5 for me is going to go to Oscar Rinnin in the top lane. We were talking in the previous games about how he just wasn't making a big enough impact, not only positively, but even really like he was kind of being negative at times, and that was going to be the concern. If Mirwin could get those advantages, that could be very in favor of Mad Lions. But here in game 5, the Kennen significantly more useful than the Nidalee in the back half of the game. Finally, the strategy just gets revealed. If they're going to pick Nidalee, don't try to contest it early. Just pick something that is going to be infinitely more useful than it in the late game, and then all of a sudden things become a lot easier to end up executing. Oscar was awesome. I don't think he whiffed an ult the entire game, like in terms of actively getting into good spots and getting those Kennen ultimates off. He was basically perfect, and honestly, he was really the driving force for how Fnatic ended up closing out this game, obviously outside of just like walking into the base and taking it, which I guess we can talk about a little bit. But player of the series as a whole for me is going to go to Noah, the AD carry here for Fnatic. To me, he was very clearly the most important player on Fnatic throughout this series. I think there might be some mentions for a couple of other players, but I didn't have to think about this one all that hard. Noah was clearly the most valuable player for Fnatic in this one. I just thought it was really all up to whether or not he could get ahead. When he won, all of a sudden Fnatic did a lot better. When he was losing, when Supa was able to get really far ahead, all of a sudden Mad Lions was doing a lot better. The only real exception was actually game number 5, which is kind of funny. Supa was Supa fed on the Ezreal on the other side of this map. Him and Alvaro had a very good game, but Mad kind of collapsed in a couple of other areas, and it led to an inability to really win fights in the late game. Of course, a horrible decision down the stretch in the macro sense to kind of throw away game number 5 at a pretty decent game state. Not like super winnable for Mad, but certainly one that was possible to at least do something in. Obviously, they make that mistake and all of a sudden the game's over, but Noah, I thought, was really the driving force through the first like 4 games of the series, especially games 2 and 3 in their wins for Fnatic. So he's gonna get player of the series, but Humanoid deserves some shouts out. I don't really think he was bad at all. I think Frescowie was maybe a little bit more exciting throughout this series on the other side, but it wasn't at the expense of Humanoid. Razork had some ups and downs. I think Jun certainly had some ups and downs, but Fnatic, even with some of those inconsistencies, were still able to get across the finish line, and that's all you can really ask for. For Mad Lions on the other side, they're going to feel very frustrated with how this series ended, but at the end of the day, they wanted to come out here and prove that they deserve to be in this top 3 conversation, that they deserve to be going to Worlds, and in my opinion, they did that. I think they came out here and showed that they are on, at the very least, a similar level to a team like Fnatic, who is, you know, very clearly talked about like one of the teams that you feel great about going to Worlds from the LEC. And so I think Mad fans, you know, I would feel pretty excited. Honestly, I'm not going to sit here and say this team is going to do well. I think the level of the LEC is not the highest it has been in quite a long time, but there are some good things to take away. Supa and Alvaro were honestly really good in this series. 3 of the 5 games, I think, you know, they were awesome. The other 2, you can definitely start to talk about some ups and downs, but Supa was amazing here in game number 5, just didn't have enough firepower to actually push across the finish line. Alvaro was also very good on the Braum, but I like the idea of trying to play through Supa, who has been your hottest player throughout the entirety of the year. Frescowie was the other player that I think made a lot of really cool plays over the course of this series. It just didn't really amount to much near the end. If he buffered that engage in game number 3 towards the end on the Tristana, they probably are winning this series and they're moving on to finals. So those are the slim margins that you end up playing towards, but unfortunately for Mad, not everybody played well. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Mirwin. I'm really out on this Nidalee pick. Man, this thing like does negative like anything after a laning phase. Like there is literally nothing that this champion does outside of like just exists. Like you can throw out spears, they do no damage. The heal is entirely inconsequential right now. Lane Nidalee, like top lane Nidalee just doesn't exist. Mirwin needs to give up on this. There are other picks that I think are more valuable than Nidalee that can be good outside of lane, that aren't just like one-trick wonders in terms of what they offer right now. This Nidalee pick just felt entirely pointless, and he's getting Dud of the game in game number 5 for it. But another champion that I think is kind of useless is Amumu. I've continued to think that he's super bait. Like North America is obsessed with this champion. We've seen a ton of players like Blabber and like Spica and even a ton of players in the NACL pull out Amumu over and over again, and I don't get it. Like, this champ never does well. He never accomplishes what you can accomplish just out of any engaged support. And it doesn't make sense in my brain. I don't think Amumu's in a good spot. Maybe argue with me in the comments if you disagree, but I've seen so many pro games of Amumu, and none of them have gone even remotely well. So I just don't know what's happening in scrims to make people think this champion's actually in a good state, because I think he's just the weakest of all of these engaged junglers that are kind of popping back up in the meta. I get that Vi and Maokai were banned out, and obviously Sedge was taken away in this one, but there are other options. There are, I mean, Xin Zhao honestly gives you more, it's a different type of champion, but it gives you a little bit more of a go button. You have something like a Jarvan that I think could function even a bit better. Like, I don't get the Amumu. It doesn't make sense in my brain. So let me know down in the comments if you agree or disagree with that take, but for Mad, they are moving down now into the lower bracket. Hopefully this is a good thing for them. This might just give them a ton of experience, and some more games might be really good. I don't know if they're going to walk out of that series with the win. They're certainly not favorites, but it wouldn't be the first time that they go into G2 and end up upsetting them. So we'll talk about that in just a second, but congratulations to Fnatic. Not only did they qualify for Worlds earlier on after the G2 win, but now they have officially qualified for the finals as well. The lowest they can be is the number 2 seed going to Worlds, and that's exactly what they want to be. They want to prove that they are one of, if not the best teams in the LEC, and I think they came pretty close here. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Season Finals Round Number 2 Winners Finals Overview and Analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Up on the screen, the updated bracket after all of those games. Only 3 teams remain in the Season Finals. Our 3 representatives for the LEC at the World Championships. Fnatic, of course, winning Winners Finals gets them into Grand Finals, and then Mad Lions losing drops them down into the lower bracket where they will meet the G2 Esports. This is a rematch, of course, of upper bracket round 1 where Mad Lions was able to come out on top in 5 games. Do we think that's going to happen again? Probably not. Like, G2 were obviously big favorites going into this series, and I think even if Mad loses this, they're still going to feel very good about their season finals performance, but if they can somehow come out here and not only, like, compete with G2, but win, like, that would be ginormous towards the confidence that they have going into the World Championships. Of course, they don't even have to win in order to feel good. I think if they take a game or two, if they push this to 5 games again, if they look as competitive as they did against Fnatic, especially in the ways that they looked good, if they can clean up some of their drafts and, you know, have bot lane continue to perform at a high level, I think that is going to inspire a lot of people to feel better about Mad Lions moving into a pretty pivotal part of the year for the LEC. So we'll see how that ends up going. I think one of Fnatic or G2 will be your champions. I just don't see a world in which Mad can now beat both G2 and Fnatic in back-to-back best-of-5s. But maybe I'm wrong. Let me know if I'm wrong, if you agree, if you disagree, down in the comment section below. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to cover the end of the LEC here, but we cover all 4 of the major regions as well. That's the LCS, the LCK, and the LPL, alongside the NACL Tier 2, of course, over in North America. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, especially with Worlds right around the corner, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.